My name is Elise. I am the Seoul Bureau Chief and an Asia correspondent for NPR, which is an American broadcaster. Thank you all for being here, and it's an honor to be with this panel today. There are actually two panels on populism during this conference. Today we're talking about populism in the United States. Tomorrow there's a separate one on populism in Europe, so let me just tease forward to that one as well. But there's plenty to talk about regarding populism and Trumpism, if you define it differently, in the US and what that means for the traditional sort of US-led post-World War II liberal world order that we've heard a lot about already this morning. To get us started, each panelist is going to give us about a 5 to 10 minute remarks, and then we'll argue with each other after that. And then I'm going to try and leave about 15 to 20 minutes for your questions. And since we have this intimate crowd today, I think it'll be a really great opportunity for exchange with one another. To start, we're going to go with the far end, Bruce Stokes. He is the Director of Global Economic Attitudes at the Pew Research Center. He's also a former journalist, economics correspondent at the National Journal. And now he is also, in addition to his responsibilities at Pew, a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund and an associate fellow at Chatham House. So Bruce, thanks for being here, and we'll let you go ahead and start.
Great. Thank you for the kind invitation to be with all of you and to share with you some of the results of our public opinion surveys and other public opinion surveys about attitudes in the United States. Before I do that, though, I'd like to make a couple of comments to put this in context. One is, I'm fairly certain that if you ask the American public about the liberal international order, they would have no idea what you're talking about. And as Chris joked, they might see it as some kind of international conspiracy or whatever. It's not, this is not the way average people think about the world or talk about the world. More importantly, it seems to me, though, is to understand people's attitudes towards elements of that world, towards trade, towards the UN, towards NATO, things of that nature. It's important, I think, to put that in a social, demographic, and political context of American public opinion. And the first thing that I think is terribly important is that we understand that the American people, and I'm not excusing them, I'm not bewailing their fate, but they have gone through an enormous amount of social and demographic change in a very short period of time, as have many other countries, but we're talking today about America. And I don't think you can understand their public opinion about the world unless you understand that in the last 50 years, they've seen the acceleration of the pace of change, which is a direct result of globalization in its many facets, from economic change to immigration change to social change, and that they are also subject to a partisanship that's emerged out of that, which helps us see more clearly how not just the American people see these international liberal order issues, but how there's such a division in the United States around these. For example, to go back to the question of change, we ask people in the United States, do you think the pace of modern life is too fast? And they say yes. We ask them, do you think your traditional way of life is being lost? And they say yes, as do many people around the world. But again, we're focusing on the US. There's an underlying reality to that. The percentage of Americans who are foreign-born has tripled in the last 50 years. We now have a higher percentage of people who are foreign-born than at any time in our history, or almost any time in our history. The percentage of non-white people in the society has tripled. There are other changes, though, that we associate with modernity, but maybe some people don't accept as a good thing, or they're having trouble with it. 75% of Americans in 1967 only had a high school education. Now, 39% of Americans only have a high school education. I dare say all of us say this is a great thing. This is wonderful. Better educated population, better for the people, better for the country. But put yourself in the shoes of that person who in 1967 was part of the vast majority of the country. It was not a rational decision to go to college. You could go to work in the steel mill like your dad did, make a good living, support your family. Now, if you're part of that 39% who only have a high school education, you're marginalized, you're disadvantaged, and you believe you're looked down upon, and you probably are looked down upon. Again, to understand this, it seems to me we have to put ourselves in the shoes of those people who may not be part of the mainstream. And bear in mind, you wouldn't be here if you weren't one of Steve Bannon's globalists. You are all part of the global elite. You have benefited from this. You've thrived in it. You've succeeded in it. And we have to try to understand that there are people who don't see themselves as part of that and effectively aren't part of that. The second element to understand about American public opinion is how polarized we have become. It's not that Americans didn't in the past disagree with things, but if you look at their values, we have never been more polarized in modern times. I'm not going to talk about the 1880s or the 1850s, but certainly in modern times. Now, how does that apply then to international liberal order issues? Trade, for example. I dare say that many of you probably believe, well, Americans are inherently protectionist. Well, we're a continental economy, we're inward looking, small percentage of our GDP is traded, but in fact, a majority of Americans say free trade is good for the country, and a majority say that free trade agreements are good for the country, and action by your government is good for the country. So in fact, in principle, people accept one of these core elements of the international liberal order. But if you dig into that data, it's 2/3 of Democrats who say that trade agreements are good for the country, and only 1/3 of Republicans. Now, frankly, I'm not so sure this is about trade at all. This is about the changing demographics of the two parties. The people who, the American public, who say that trade is good for the country are disproportionately women, minorities, and young people. Stop and think about that for a minute. What portion of the population never had manufacturing jobs to lose on margin? It was women, minorities, and young people, because they never had those jobs. Who are the people in the United States population who are most opposed to trade? It's old white men like me. It's the 2/3 of my high school graduating class who didn't go to college because, as I said, that was an irrational decision. But those jobs in the steel mill didn't last. And their lives, to their view, were destroyed by that. And now they finally have a candidate who says, I'll bring those jobs back. You know, I'll stand up for you. I'll speak out for you in the way that no one else has. The thing, I think, in that finding, though, to also ponder is that women, minorities, and young people are disproportionately in the services sector in the United States. They have never faced much global competition. As global competition begins to edge into the services sector, how will those people react? I dare say that there's a potential there, at least, for a populist backlash among services workers that is comparable to the populist backlash we had among manufacturing workers. And the competition may not come from international, it may come from robots, it may come from artificial intelligence. But I'll tell you, when we've asked people about this, they say, well, we say, what do you want to do about these robots who the people say are going to displace us? Oh, we think the government should stop that. So will there be some populist candidate in the United States who promises to stop? Not that he maybe can or she can, but there's a potential there. Trade agreements. Basically, right before the election, we asked about TPP because it was still an issue of the United States. What was interesting there was 54% of Clinton supporters supported TPP, even though she was against it, and 66% of Trump supporters opposed it. So there is a split along that element of the international order. NAFTA, which we're still renegotiating. Majority of Republicans are against it. A majority of Democrats are in favor of it. Again, we're split on this. interesting in that attitudes towards NAFTA that I think is important in thinking about the populist backlash. When we ask people who benefits more from NAFTA, Mexico or the United States, Democrats, a majority of Democrats say we both benefit equally. A majority of Republicans say no, the Mexicans benefit more. So one of the other elements of this is a sense of victimization, that somehow we have been victimized. We both personally, but also we as a nation. A couple of other points. UN, Americans generally see UN favorably. 62% say they have a favorable view of the UN. Now it's down somewhat, I will admit to that, but again, huge partisan difference. 81% of Democrats say that they have a favorable view of the UN. Only 44% of Republicans do. NATO. 6 out of 10 Americans have a favorable view of NATO, but it's 78% of Democrats and only 47% of Republicans. So again, there's a split and it's through a partisan lens that people see the international order. We ask people, should we help other countries with their problems, or should we let them deal with their own problems? Now, a majority of Americans say let them deal with their own problems. I mean, that's kind of an inward-looking, quasi-isolationist view, but it was 70% of Trump supporters in October of 2016 said let them deal with their own problems. 56% of Clinton supporters said no, we have to help people. So again, huge differences over that. We believe, part of the victimization again, that everybody else doesn't do enough to contribute to the world order and that we do too much. We've asked people about defense spending, just to give you an example of that specifically. Basically, 45% of plurality of Americans say the Europeans should spend more in defense. Now, frankly, they don't have any idea how much the Europeans spend in defense, but that's really not important. This is an attitude rather than a test of factual knowledge. But it's 63% of Republicans who say that, as opposed to only 33% of Democrats. So again, a totally different view of the international, or these elements of the international order, based on the partisan lens that people see the world. Another example of this, Republicans tell us they want to be liked for American power, and Democrats say we want to be liked for American policies. We ask people, should we negotiate and compromise with other countries, or should we do what's best for the United States no matter what others think? 80% of Democrats say we should negotiate and compromise, and 57% of Republicans say no, we should do what's best for America. So again, there's a difference over that. Some good news here. There is bilateral support bipartisan support for among Americans to defend South Korea if it was attacked by North Korea. Slightly stronger among Republicans than Democrats, but even a majority of Democrats expressed that support. So on some of these issues, and similarly defending countries against an attack by China, a majority of Americans support that, and it includes a majority of both Republicans and Democrats, although again, Republicans are slightly more supportive of that than Democrats. So there are some elements of this where actually the public is in agreement, but in many of these elements of the international liberal order, there is disagreement, but it's along partisan lines. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Bruce Stokes. And sitting right next to me is Dr. Ed Feulner, who you may have heard this morning in the keynote. And if not, we're going to actually kind of zero in on the populism idea that you teased in your talk. So Dr. Feulner, longtime president of the Heritage Foundation. I don't think he needs much introduction, but you've just heard these top-line observations and research from Bruce Stokes. Tell us what you think.
Thanks, Elise. And Bruce, thank you, because Pew does great work, and we use it routinely at Heritage and across the board in other think tanks as well in Washington. Well, my fellow globalists, someone asked me after my keynote speech this morning, since I was talking about draining the swamp, and I've been there for 50 years, aren't I part of the swamp? And I said, well, actually, I like to say I'm in Washington, but not of Washington. So that little distinction, I hope, buys me a little bit of liberty. The panel discussion this morning hit on some subjects that I will try to come back to. But the first thing I want to say is that, and I would welcome Bruce's comments on this particularly, as I said this morning, there right now in the United States, there are two forms of populism. Donald Trump personifies what happened with the Tea Party over the last 5 or 6 years. Excessive taxation, government interference in private lives in various ways, whether it had to do with real or imagined issues that do or don't affect everybody, but certainly questions that were raised on the national scene, whether it had to do with transgender bathrooms in primary schools or who got how much in a student loan. All of those were gelled finally into a political movement and into a political candidate who came along and, as I said this morning, expanded the whole range of the debate and was elected basically as a conservative populist. At the same time, at the same time, in the same campaign, you had a very different kind of populist, Bernie Sanders, appealing to the Occupy Wall Street and related hardcore group on the left saying, in effect, and maybe this is oversimplification, equality of results, not equality of opportunity. We all ought to have our student loans forgiven because they're too much of a burden. And what happens, some of the candidates on that side, in fact, come along and promise that. And I point this out, obviously I have my own opinion on it, but I pointed out to say that there are actually these two forms of populism currently raging, really, within the United States, in my opinion. And that's probably one of the reasons why there is as much conflict as there is in the political spectrum. I well remember, as a young Republican staffer on Capitol Hill, where Republicans were always in the minority, but we could always count on a certain block of Democrats to vote with us. There was genuine bipartisanship. If any of you have read much about the Reagan administration, you know that Reagan, conservative Republican, would routinely invite Tip O'Neill, liberal Democrat, Speaker of the House, down. They would share a cocktail, they'd talk about what they might be able to do together, and oftentimes they did do some things together. That's pretty much unheard of these days, alas. One of the points that was made this morning, though, that I think it was Charlie made it from Georgetown, and that was, at one point we thought we were at the end of history. And the reason we thought we were at the end of history was because at that stage the Berlin Wall crumbled, there was no longer a Warsaw Pact. In effect, for many of us, at least in the United States, the glue that kind of held Americans together in a bipartisan sense from early post-World War II was anti-communism. That's what brought Bob Taft and Harry Truman together early in the 50s. And later on, it brought Jack Kennedy and even Richard Nixon together in the 60s. So you had this kind of glue held us together. All of a sudden it's gone. What's there to hold us together other than some of these things like the LIO institutions that, again, we talked about this morning? And I'll tell you why there's a problem there on the Trump side. Within the last week, a couple reports came out about the IMF. First report, Steve Mnuchin, Trump's Treasury Secretary, is going to propose I guess he did at the IMF meetings over this weekend in Washington, a $16 billion replenishment of the IMF capital draw, $16 billion from us. At the same time, if you read the annual report of the IMF coming out at that time, something like 40% of all the loans given out by the IMF are going to China and China's projects. At the same time, China is doing what they're doing with Belt and Road that we heard about this morning, and the 26 out of 27 European ambassadors in China who complained about the fact that under Chinese contracts, Western European countries, or European countries, are not getting a fair shake. All these things, on the one side, that's not a populist issue, but it certainly is an issue in terms of the definition of the ILO and the institutions that represent it in the post-World War era. And how do we redefine it? And one of the things where I think I would agree with everybody this morning is, how do we all come back together and find the things that unite us? Because in my time in Washington, I've always believed very strongly that getting ahead means add and multiply, don't subtract and divide. Thank you, Elise.
Thank you, Dr. Feulner. So what does this all mean for Korea, and what do Koreans think about it? Dr. Kim Jiyoon is a senior fellow in the Public Opinion Studies program at Asan. She is the leading expert in Korean public opinion and has a PhD from MIT. You can talk a lot to us about what this means, I guess, in this region. So interpret for us what Koreans are thinking, Dr. Kim.
Well, thank you for kind introduction, but I'm not really, I didn't really prepare to talk about Korea, but well, I can talk about how Korean people think about the U.S. recently and how to think about Donald Trump. But at this point here, I actually would like to make a point that United States, America, has a long and rich history of populism. I mean, the populism actually comes from the American history, and you probably can remember William Jennings Bryan, who was a populist and eventually became the Democratic Party's presidential candidate in 1896. And there's also in the late 19th century, there's a huge populist movement, like this coming out from the farms and those disenfranchised farmers who felt they are left out, and they wanted to attack the industrialization, the urbanization, and the influx of the immigrants. And it sounds really familiar. I mean, it has been repeated again during the history. And you can also talk about the Lafayette and also FDR's New Deal policy. This is more like inclusive populist movement. And he's the one who actually really liked to talk to people through the radio, like fireside chat, which is the FDR's version of Twitter, I would say. And yeah, and then also you can go to Jack Kennedy, and there's Joe McAfee who used the, obviously the fear-mongering tactic, against those Reds. So there's tons of examples in the history, a really, really long and rich history of populism in the United States. And Dr. Feulner mentioned Tea Party movement, and Bernie Sanders occupied Wall Street, and Donald Trump, and it all sounds really familiar things that's repeated in history. So having said that, what's new about Donald Trump? I don't really say anything new about Donald Trump. It's a repeated history in American history. So, and also about this, because this panel is about the populism and the liberal international order. And let's go back to the liberal international order. Well, there's outcries that the liberal international order is collapsing, but you have to also think about that is coming out of liberal scholars. There's two perspectives, basically. The liberal scholars, they say, well, this is Donald Trump. Maybe he's not solely responsible for that, but he's expediting, basically making the collapse or decay of the liberal international order. And then there's the economic recession and globalization and inequality in the society, and that's all the reasons. But on the other hand, from the realist side, it was already happening. It was already coming. And Donald Trump is not really solely responsible, but he's made the product of the collapse or decay of LIO. I mean, you can think of Bill Clinton, who was probably good-hearted, but sort of like an amateuristic in terms of the foreign policy. And George W. Bush, well, maybe he filled his cabinet with a lot of experts, but ideologically driven neocons, basically. And Obama looked like a protector of LIO, but he was the one who actually had a policy like offshore balancing, the security strategy, and also reshoring policy. And then the bullshit that he brought a lot of jobs back home. So, I mean, he's not really that extravagant, and or he's so outspoken, and maybe he was not really tweeting in the 3 a.m. in the morning. But maybe it's a little bit more exaggerated in the case of Donald Trump, but I don't really see that Donald Trump is solely, truly so responsible for this whole thing. And come to think of liberal international order, there's some pillars, very important elements, such as multilateralism, free trade, and democracy. Some people say that the number of countries in democracy is declining. I look at the numbers, but it's not really true. The rate of increase in the number of the democratic country is decreasing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that number of the democratic world is decreasing. Still, it is outnumbering, that the increased part is outnumbering the authoritarian regime. And well, in terms of multilateralism, although Donald Trump walked out of Paris Accord and he's walked out the TPP and everything, but still, the Paris Accord is alive, and even North Korea signed it. And TPP, thanks to Japan's significant role, it is still alive at the CPTPP. So there's a lot of multilateral activities going on in the world. And the free trade, President Trump is mentioning not just the free trade, but fair trade. But there's a lot of FTAs, deals I made. EU and Japan has made an FTA, and the EU and Canada has finalized it. And there's a lot of efforts for the FTA, and it's very welcomed in the developing world. So I would say that it is still alive. Maybe it's declined a little, but it's still very well alive without the United States. So for your information, I'm not really the person who firmly believes there's a liberal international order, which made the world peace for the past 70 years, because it was not. I mean, if you look at the number of the war casualties, it was dramatically soaring until like 1990, and then it was decreasing. So it was only very novice theory. Maybe it was the theory to back up the US global leadership after the Soviet bloc is gone, after the communist bloc is gone, because they needed some solid theory to support the global leadership of the United States. So I would say, as repeatedly, the element and the aspect of a liberal international order is still there. And maybe we are losing its global leadership, or tainted its global leadership by the United States. Well, everybody understood that it is not, the US was not like the US before, but still believed in the leadership and trusted in the US sort of a status. And I don't know, maybe some Korean people particularly have some high standard, moral standard, believe that the American people and American politics has higher moral standard. Well, it seems like, I'm not saying that they have low moral standard, but I'm saying that maybe we're pretty similar, I think. So, well, at this point, it is not gone, and then still there are players who want to, play the rules-based order. I actually do not really believe the order. How can you possibly say that in the international world, in the world, in the order in the same sentence, because the word is in disarray usually. But yeah, the question is this for the United States: will the world wait for the U.S. return? So that was the big question I have for this panel, and I'll stop here.
Great, thank you, Dr. Kim Jiyoon. I can't wait to get to questions, but
can I talk?
But next we will go to Chris Nelson, who is the editor and publisher of the Nelson Report, which many of you probably get in your inboxes, an authoritative newsletter. And he's a consultant for Samuels International. Previously, he was a longtime journalist and Hill staffer. Chris Nelson, over to you.
Thank you, Elise. I started out writing radio news for UPI in New York 50 years ago. 50.
Yeah,
I was.
So
And not only was I 5 years old, I learned how to type on the job, because in those days men didn't type. Typing was what girl stuff did. And it was quite possible to graduate from college never having typed your own papers. It's so embarrassing when I look back on it. But I did. I started out. Actually, I was an intern, Cal on the Capitol, in the summer of 1965. My first job on the Hill was with a liberal Republican. Remember Brownie Reed, Ogden Reed? Yeah, I was his press secretary, starting in 1970. I make the point because back in those days, you could be a Democrat and work for a Republican and survive it. And as Ed pointed out, there was actually a period where bipartisanship really did work. Tip O'Neill really did go have drinks with Ronald Reagan, and they really did get stuff done. But starting in the late 80s, that was, it was mostly Republican friends decided it was kind of risky compromising with Democrats because that's what kept Republicans in the minority. So if you ever wanted to win again, you had to actually stand forth and stop cooperating. So anyway, that isn't what we're going to talk about right now. But I did want to start with where I come from. Ed says he's in but not of D.C. I am of D.C. I am a career Washington staffer. You're looking at pretty much what you're going to get if you spend your whole damn life trying to make government and politics and other things work in some reasonably rational way. I've chosen to do it for the last 30 years through mainly journalism, but if people ask you, how do you really see yourself? I'm just an overage hill rat. I want to know what you're doing and is it going to work, and if it's not working, what the hell are you doing it for? So that's where I'm coming from. So with that, I'm going to start reading, but I wanted to thank Bruce especially for his analysis, because you're going to hear echoes of what he was talking about and what I'm about to read to you. And I have to say, it's very unusual for me. I don't usually type things out, but I wanted to make sure I was reasonably logical by my standards. So here we are. Two famous historic quotes or assertions start off for me. You all know the Declaration of Independence, of course. It cites life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the guaranteed goal of the American experiment. And that's now seen as the principal responsibility of society, and the political arguments being on the role of government in working with everybody else in helping secure this goal in their current societal or political definitions. Now, that's my first point. You also know, of course, the saying of Tip O'Neill saying all politics is local, but what we usually forget is Tip also said something that I think is more important. He said all politics is about who gets what. And that brings us directly to the EU complaint about the Belt and Road, isn't it? The EU is just basically bitching because they're not getting a piece of the action. Well, okay, that's fair enough, but that's really what it's about. Who's going to get what? Why should we give money to the Chinese if they're not going to sign contracts with us? So that's my first main point. My second main point. You may know the perhaps wishful admonition made famous by Martin Luther King Jr., but originally from the radical abolitionist preacher of another crisis period in American history, Theodore Parker, in the 1850s. He said, "The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Well, my argument today, my concern, is that the American experiment in liberal international order is in a crisis it may not survive because a significant portion of the electorate has lost faith in Reverend Parker's assertion. And that's because the post-World War II American dream, the economic culture and social order that created what is commonly accepted as the liberal international order, now no longer is reliable for a huge segment of our population. Not just, but mainly the non-college educated and up to this point, middle class. One result has been to feed the clearly divisive national cultures, plural, called identity politics, with emphasis on individual or discrete group grievance at the expense of national cohesion. As we saw in November 2016, significant percentages of the white vote, in quotes, is now influenced by a sense of grievance that all of the minority, racial, and other affirmative action set-asides and benefits work to unfairly disadvantage the white majority. And this sense of we don't get any breaks but others do at our expense is reinforced now by resentment that immigrants, whether legal or illegal, are not just taking entry-level jobs and driving down wage scales, but that their alleged resistance to assimilation is somehow diluting American culture. And Bruce underscored how important it is to note that increasingly America is more of a nation of immigrants than it really has been in probably over 100 years. So this is what, and the fact that the immigrants are allegedly not integrating properly into American culture, it's nonsense, but and it's what has been said about immigrants in the United States, starting really with the Germans in the 1840s and the Irish prior to the Civil War. The fact that that's always been that way is utterly irrelevant because Americans really don't know our own history and we don't study these kinds of things. But specifically to affirmative action. History teaches that all reforms eventually breed their own contradictions or abuses, even though those reforms clearly were and sometimes still are needed. There was a reason for minority set-asides. There's a reason for all this stuff, right? And that's why Well, that's already fed the reason why things are still dead, that's already fed the political crisis we now see under the Trump administration, but which in retrospect has been building for a generation. Identity politics now works to feed the tribalism cancer that is destroying the American consensus. That's why, even if Clinton had been elected, we would still have a governance crisis. Just now it's worse due to the crisis of governance competence, accentuating the historic changes underway. The fact is that we urban and suburban elites, us global elites here, on a bipartisan basis, simply missed what was happening in the rest of America. And the Trump election proves that. So the main challenge for us governing elites now, that's because of rapid technological change, exacerbated by misgovernance and underwritten by trade and globalization. This now is predicted to threaten the jobs of half of the US workforce, educated elites and working class alike, by 2050, whether it's robots or whatever. Half of the US workforce is going to be in really deep kimchi by 2050. Now, I'm going to be beyond senile, probably won't care, but my grandchildren will be around there, so I worry about this, and we all have to worry about it, because it is literally undermining belief in the American dream, and it's right to be undermining it. We've got to have to come up with something here. And the next person who talks to me about buggy whip makers going to work for the Ford company, I'm going to pop them one, because things are different. Anyway, where are we? So 2050, in short, no one is safe in the sense of what the great bulk of Americans took for granted since 1945, and really through the Reagan years, that somehow things are going to provide, well, maybe not. No one may be safe except maybe the top 1%. So that's why the two bedrock propositions that I noted at the outset increasingly don't work or are at risk of failing to work. And this makes meeting the challenge of the death of the international liberal order the supreme socio-political challenge of our time, especially if you think yourself part of the global elite and it's part of your job to solve it, right? Oversimplification is, of course, unavoidable in a conference context. So here's mine. If the ILO can't provide meaningful employment for the great bulk of the population over the next generation, our entire socioeconomic system, American society as we know it, will collapse, and it will deserve to. The duty of a good liberal, which is what I am, is to suggest solutions. So here's an easy one. Tax policy that doesn't dramatically reward and encourage reinvestment of earnings and profits into job-creating R&D is not just suicidal, it's unpatriotic. So I'm ready to get a job at Heritage, eh? Yeah, it's betrayal of the American dream, right? So to give this teeth, in quotes, the Nelson tax policy is any profit spent on buying back stock or paying management huge salary, man, hit that with a tax. Melt down those statutes. So if we're right, and it's mainly about jobs, here's a couple of subsidiary correlations. Again, this is Grandpa speaking. Global warming must be met technologically and politically. By definition, that means relevant jobs must be created, or life on Earth itself may perish. So, a final thought in this necessarily brief and likely glib analysis, speaking from my perspective as a professional journalist. The crisis has been fed by the increasing collapse of nationally recognized mediators of fact, news, analysis, and all that those words imply. The fragmentation of the media long ago made the critical governance task of forging national consensus difficult, and now it's even more so. For the first time, we have a president who deliberately destroys public faith in any institution, especially the media, but also the courts, Congress, the FBI, and the elites per se, and he does so as a tactic against literally any potential challenge to him personally. So, and that's just what's going on. So for the first time, well, so as a journalist, here's my required and liberal suggestion. We journalists must spend every working moment telling truth to power and rigorously analyzing what works and what doesn't and why. And because of Trump's personal issues, that includes constantly fact-checking in hope of making it still possible for American society to rediscover a working sense of national political and cultural identity. So that's my speech. Thank you for your patience. Oh, I should say, Ed Luce was going to be here to do this panel, and unfortunately couldn't. This is a really important and terrific book. I get nothing from its sale, but it absolutely is worth reading for the general analysis. But if you're interested in what's happening in America, why did Hillary blow it so badly, things like that, that really matters. You know, if our governing elites can't even figure out how to talk to the people, how in the hell do they expect to govern them? This is a really important book. Ed Luce, Financial Times, good Englishman.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris Nelson. We had a more sanguine look, a more pessimistic look.
I'm not pessimistic, I'm scared. Seriously, there's a difference.
And I can't wait to dive into that. But one more speaker first. We have Jungkun, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Kyung University. And he is also a PhD from University of Texas at Austin, UT. Go Longhorns. And currently is teaching courses in US politics, US foreign policy, and party politics. So I can't wait to hear your perspective.
As long as you're not a Dallas Cowboys fan, we'll get along fine. All right.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to join this panel. And I'm a political scientist and teaching American politics in Seoul, Korea. Whenever I'm saying this to my American friends, they are saying that, oh, poor you. So I mean, it's a very tough job to analyze and teach American politics these days, because when I was a doctoral student at Austin, Texas, I learned a lot, but the textbook style of information seems to not work anymore. Things are very changing quickly, so I need to catch up a lot. In any case, in political science, I have to say that there is not much research on populism. We don't know, we don't identify who they are, what they want, and especially when populism type of people are not saying that I'm populist. They are hiding something, they are grumbling, they are wanting to something from politics, but not vividly and stuff like that. So now I'm just saying that as political scientists, we have some hard time analyzing this concept of populism in the United States very systematically. But I would just bring up some four big picture type of questions for this panel. First question is American populism isolationism? Well, I mean, Jiyoon has mentioned briefly about William Jennings Bryan, and whenever you talk about populist and isolationist, you have to be remembering this guy from Nebraska and the election of 1896. What's striking to me is the fact that he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson as Secretary of State, and he had to resign from the post to protest against Woodrow Wilson's getting more and more involved in the World War I history. And on the Republican side, we have Robert Taft from state of Ohio. These days, we don't talk a lot about this pro-Europe, pro-Asia faction within the Republican Party anymore. But back then, Robert Taft was a leading voice within the Republican Party, pro-Asia and sort of Midwestern isolationism politician. But he lost his candidacy to Eisenhower, as we all know, and he passed away the following year. And so from 1953 through 1994, the Gingrich Revolution, the Republican Party has been becoming more and more party of internationalism. So my point here is that William Jennings Bryan, a three-time presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, but he failed. Robert Taft, pro-Asia Republican guy, but he lost his power, and the Republican Party has become the party of internationalism for a whole period of time. And what's interesting now is that through the elections of midterm elections in 1994, this Midwestern Republican forces calling for more isolationist type of policy seems to be coming back. And this is what I have found from my own research. that is, I remember Mitch McConnell, a junior senator from Kentucky, who was actually trying to defeat the US DPRK agreed framework, agreed by Kim Jong-il and Bill Clinton. Because, I mean, the United States had to fund this KADO, the Korean Energy Development Organization, as agreed by US DPRK, but Mitch McConnell was a leading voice to defeat this KADO funding policy. Maybe it was more about Clinton, not more about North Korea, but still, Mitch McConnell was a leading voice back then. And what's interesting here is that, as Bruce mentioned, 1/3 of the voters in the United States who voted for Obama twice, 2008, 2012, voted for Trump in 2016. Mm-hmm. So I would call them Obama-Trump voters. I mean, I know how weird this term may sound, but there must be something going on. And especially when Obama was saying that we need to focus more on nation building at home, not nation building abroad. So some segment of the American electorate is supportive of this nation building at home type of politician in the name of Barack Obama in 2008, but maybe they have got some disillusioned about Obama and some Democratic Party's positions. So now they choose Donald Trump in 2012. So 2016, I'm sorry. So there must be something going on within the whole country out there. And next question is the American populism, conservatism. Well, this is also mentioned by Bruce a little bit. But what's striking is the fact that if you look at which party do you support among high school graduates of American electorate, up until 2008, it was like 51-49, 49-51. The Republican and Democratic Party, not much differences between amongst the high school graduates of the American electorate. But 2008, and since then, it has become sort of 2-to-1 ratio, Republicans. So 2008 election, as you recall, Barack Obama was elected. So this high school graduate of the American electorate supportive of the Republican Party since 2008 seems to me it's saying something about American populism and conservatism as well. But I mean, personally still believe that Trump did better than Hillary. Trump did better than Romney. I don't think so. It's more to do with sort of blacks' low turnout in 2016 elections, like Detroit, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or the Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Pennsylvania area. The lower than expected black turnout has made a huge difference in terms of those swing states for 2016 elections. And what about income inequality and conservative ideology? Populism seems to be obsessed with this notion of inequality. But as you recall, during the campaign of 2016, Donald Trump has never mentioned about income inequality. So there seems to be no linkage here between American populism as we know and conservatism as advocated by Donald Trump in 2016. Number 3 is American populism racism? Well, as Bruce also mentioned, I mean, there are huge demographic changes, and it seems to lead to democratic changes. And I have to say that these demographic changes and Midwestern Rust Belt development and changes, and I mean, it's striking. Like when there was a Charlottesville, Virginia incident last year, I was very shocked to see the so-called white supremacist chanting like "We will not be replaced." Oh my goodness, that's the way they feel about the country. That's the way they feel about the politics. So that was very shocking to me. But in any case, the populism and racism and presidential politics, I think that has a lot to do with swing state politics in presidential politics, because if those Midwestern, Rust Belt, white working class based states are not swing states, then that is telling or giving us a very different picture of American politics for now. So like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, those states are just swing states, so that politicians wanting to get into the White House has to think about those states and those voters and those difficulties. But swing states in American politics, historically speaking, it has changed. If you recall, the 1880s, which state was a swing state? California. California was a swing state in the 1880s and 1890s. And even though the Electoral College vote for the state of California was just 6, it was very critical swing state vote back in the 1880s. So we'll see how this swing state politics and American election politics will change over time following these demands and voices from the Midwestern states. Final point, is American populism Trumpism? Well, it's tough to conclude, but one thing clear to me is that populism is largely driven by the politics of fear, the politics of failure, the politics of anger. And is this politics Trump doing? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But I would say the politics Trump is making is closer to the politics of winning. So politics of winning, politics of winning versus politics of failure, I don't know. There must be some differences here. So, I mean, in Trump's mindset, of course, I haven't talked to Trump yet, but in Trump's mindset, I would say there's always the concept of winning over Obama, winning over the liberal media, winning over whoever. So this politics of winning seems to be telling us a little bit different story about politics of failure versus politics of success in the age of Trump. So in that sense, I was surprised to see Trump trying to have some meeting with Kim Jong-un, because I thought that Trump was trying to delay this game until the midterm elections in November, and finding some scapegoat and rally around the flag effect. So I thought that Trump would go in that direction in dealing with North Korea, but Trump is now heading into the politics of winning. So that is something I have to say. And final thought about the midterm elections coming in November. I think that election is very critical, because election is the first nationwide election after 2016 presidential election. So we could gauge where this American populism is heading. And obviously, there are very different dynamics between presidential elections and congressional elections. There's no doubt about it. So if this election is about right candidate, right message type of elections back again, kind of traditional electoral politics, electoral mechanism coming back again, and Trump is having the Democratic Party as a majority party in 116th Congress in next January, then we could have some more debates about where this American populism is heading. So that's my final thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that you left it on that forward-looking note, because that's actually a great place for us to start. The midterm elections and what a changeover, more likely in the House than the Senate, from what it looks like, would mean for the liberal international order that we're talking about today. There's this sense that the Trump administration is pulling back from the world, vis-a-vis pulling out of Paris and TPP. Would it be different if the congressional leadership changed in one way or the other. I'll let you guys jump in, and then you can push back on one another. Yeah.
And Bruce, I think, does this for a living, so forgive me, but off-year elections are almost always a referendum on the president. How is he doing? Usually, stuff like trade or as long as we're not in a big war, the issues are more local or how is the president doing? What do you think? So if the election somehow isn't about Trump, that would be pretty unusual. What are we seeing right now? As you know, his popularity numbers are pretty much frozen in the high 30s. Sometimes he gets up to 41 or 40, but it's right around that 40 number. Historically, a president at 40 is going to be a drag on his party. There are paths for Trump to run in 2020 and get reelected, but they're a bit convoluted. So most people think that if the numbers hold, including the generic number, which is if you had to vote tomorrow, are you going to vote Republican or are you going to vote Democratic? Those numbers are in the 5-6 points for Democrats. Historically, again, that means that the Democrats are going to win in November. Whether it's going to be a huge wave, which historically would have been the case with that kind of number, maybe not because of all of our gerrymandering issues and all the details we don't need to get into here. But it's looking pretty good for the Democrats retaking the House. On the Senate races are always a bit more difficult because senators are running statewide. They raise their own money. There's all kinds of stuff going on. One of the ways, so we'll just see. It looks good for the Democrats, but between now and then, who knows? Trump's going to meet Kim Jong-un. None of us were predicting that one. Although, as it turns out, the CIA has been talking to the North Koreans for maybe a few months now. So every day there's another tweet or another leak that shows us there's been stuff going on in the background of the North Korea that we had absolutely no idea about. But for now, the off year looks like it's leaning Democratic. And I just wanted to emphasize, my main point. People's feelings about everything, including whether they're populist or not, it's largely economic. Do you feel economically comfortable? Do you have a job? Are your kids going to have a job? Do I have to worry about that kind of thing? So if people are feeling good about themselves, we'll see.
But would a shift in power be relevant at all? Would a shift in control of the House or the Senate be relevant in terms of where the U.S. plays in the global sphere?
Yeah. Well, if you're a free trader, it's relevant because the Democrats taking over the House are going to make it damn hard to pass any trade deals. So, I'm sure Ed knows more about this than I do, but the latest gossip is that as soon as U.S. Chair Lighthizer has finished, wrapped up NAFTA with our Mexican and Canadian friends, and that's done, then Trump is going to officially give notice on withdrawing from the existing NAFTA in an effort to try to force Congress to adopt this new plan, whether they want to or not. So, it can get pretty weird, and maybe even into astrology. But I think most people, if you're a liberal internationalist trade type, you're not all that thrilled about the Democrats coming back.
Yeah. Can I jump in on a couple things? One, going back to Bruce's opening comments, but everybody has kind of skirted one of the things that I threw out, and that is that there's also right now a populism of the left. Bernie Sanders, et cetera. And this goes to a point you made, Chris, with the bifurcation of the news media.
Yeah.
Conservatives only watch Fox, liberals only watch CNN or CNBC, et cetera, and we all blog and watch our own friends' posts.
Yeah.
There's less and less pulling us together, and there's Saunders and Trump. And, this is not healthy, I say as a conservative, who would like to see, again, addition and multiplication, not division and subtraction.
Yeah. If I could amplify what Ed just said, our surveys show that it's not just that people disagree or they have different news sources, which they do, but we have increasingly ideologically self-segregated ourselves. We ask people, would you like to live in a community where everybody thinks like you, or would you like to live in a community where people have different views? And, you know, about 20% of the conservatives and 20% of the liberals say, well, I really only want to live in a community where everybody thinks like me. More recently, we asked people, would you like to live in a big house on a big lot, but you have to drive to everything, or would you like to live in a smaller house on a smaller lot, you can walk to everything? And Democrats said they want to live in a small house and a small lot and walk to everything, and Republicans said they want to live in a big lot and drive to everything. So we are choosing in our own lives to separate ourselves from different points of view, different perspectives on life. And it seems to me the challenge that poses is, what do you do about that? Those are individual human decisions that, you know, government is never going to be able to kind of force people to live together in different neighborhoods. Now, we did that to a certain extent with racial integration, but even then it wasn't forcing people, it was just making it possible. And the people I know and trust on the future of kind of congressional kind of work suggest that even if we were to change the gerrymandering system we now have, that, as you know, if any of you have ever looked at the maps of our congressional districts, they increasingly look like amoeba. Even if you could fix that, it would only fix about 20% of the problem. That 80% of the problem is about this self-selection of people to kind of ideologically segregate themselves. So, you know, you have this clustering in the cities and on the coasts of young people and minorities, and then you have, you know, older people, whiter people, basically spread out all over the country, and that's going to be harder to fix. And as a result, it gives people a different perspective on the world and on reality based on their self-interest, based on their fears of the changes that are going on. I mean, bear in mind in the United States that the highest anti-immigrant sentiment in the country is in those counties with the fewest immigrants. You know, so it's the fear of the other. It's the fear of the change, to go back to my point before, which I don't think we can underestimate. And the challenge is, it seems to me, we all, I dare say, looking around, you all took at least one economics course at some point. And you're all children of Karl Marx and Adam Smith, and you could believe economics explains everything. And I was an economics journalist for 25 years. That certainly, I believe, the power of economics. We all could sit around here and in 15 minutes come up with 10 things to do to fix our economies. Half of it wouldn't work, half of it wouldn't pass our parliament. But the point is, we'd have ideas. What do you do about the fact that it's pretty certain from the polling data and just from our own political experience that it's not that some people consider themselves racist, but they really don't want to live next to an African American. You know, what are they? You know, it's not that they're kind of xenophobic, but gee, there's an awful lot of Hispanics and there's too much Spanish and all this kind of thing going on. You know, or people probably kind of subconsciously knew there were always gay people around, but you know, now like those little old ladies who live down the street, they just aren't nice roommates. They're married. They're out. You know, it's in my face. I mean, do I have to deal? And what do you do with that? Because you don't want to endorse people's racism or their xenophobia or their homophobia, but we can't continue to say, which I think we implicitly have been saying, well, you're a racist and you need to get over it. You know, get on with it. Or you're a homophobe. Stop that. Because those people vote. And they vote for people who say, look, I can take us back to a period when America was not maybe so diverse and the pace of change was slower. And so how do we address all these problems? I don't have an answer for that. But I think that's the challenge going forward, that we have to figure out a way to help people through this accelerating pace of change without endorsing the kind of negative reactions they may have, which, you know, they don't consider it necessarily that negative. They just consider it's like, I'm uneasy with this and I would rather, you know, stop the world. I'd like to get off.
I've been pessimistic up to this point, so let me be optimistic. I think Bruce is absolutely right to identify these cleavages, but I think there's a generational thing here that gives us hope. Younger people, regardless of whether they consider themselves Democrats or Republicans or independents, or like most young people, unfortunately, they're not even going to vote. Drives you crazy. But on almost all those issues, they're very progressive. You know, they don't worry about gays. They don't worry about any of this stuff. You know, they take it for granted. You know, it's like they're all on Facebook and they're all doing stuff that I can't even begin to understand because that's just how they are. Most of the things that Bruce mentioned are hang-ups of the older people. So I think actually, with luck, American society is going to outgrow these hang-ups. Yeah, we may have our future hang-ups, but those are pretty encouraging if you look at where the kids are. Yeah. But Ed's something that I really think we need to dive down in, and that is, and I mentioned it in my report, how do you forge a national consensus when there is no more nationally recognized media mediators? Each side demonizes the other side's media, often with good cause. And you know, I listen to NPR, but as you know, you guys don't have a huge share of the audience. You try really hard to be objective, and I think you do a great job. Yeah. But you know, most people are not listening, unfortunately, to NPR. So you know, we are back in some ways in an 1850s situation where every town in America had like 5 newspapers, and they did too, and they were identified by party preference or religious preference. So you each got your newspaper, and you didn't read the other guy's newspaper. And we're sort of back to that now, so that we're not even talking to each other. We're just talking to each other. You know?
I think you're expecting too much from the ordinary voters in the first place.
Well, they don't vote, so I have no expectations,
okay.
but I have hopes when they grow
on the
up.
note that Bruce mentioned, that the most racist counties are the places with the least number of the immigrants, and that actually was really interesting, and checked it out before, and I found it, and that was really interesting. And on that note, it is actually, I'm in charge of public opinions program at Asan Institute, and I always do a lot of pollings, and I find that it is political elites who actually made a public opinion. I mean, I'm not saying that they are manipulating it, but it is their influence that has a huge impact on how people think about on the specific issues, because usually people do not really think through or think hard about the issue, political issues, the foreign policies, who cares? I mean, it's all those things in the newspapers, and they just read the headline. So that's a long theory. It's very much a mainstream theory in the political psychology. So it's the political elites who make the opinions, and that is clearly shown in the case of the President Trump. Because whoever thought the Democrats really support hard the free trade. I mean, I also quoted a few research their surveys, and there's a huge differences how many people how many Democrats support the free trade. That was unimaginable like 20 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. AFL-CIO, yeah.
Yeah. And then now it is a time not really, I don't know, I mean, the Republicans has their own problem, how they make the Tea Party movers in the subdivision, and they just, absorb them and more centrify them, or just, go there. I mean, that's their problem. But Democrats also have their problem. They have to make their agenda, and they have to clarify where they want to go. Is it going to stay the old language, old blue collar, the Midwest, the Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those areas, and then try to encompass those contradictory agendas like environmental issues? Or they are just going to the smarter and kind of, well-educated liberalism, and that's their, problem. But it seems like neither party is delving into, researching or trying to solve that question. And that's, I think, the most tragic part of American politics right now.
I mean, I would agree. If you look at our data, in 2014, 59% of the public said trade agreements were good for the country. By October of 2016, it was 45%. Wow. So the political dialogue does drive public opinion. You had 3 major candidates attacking trade, and to Donald Trump's credit, he understood better than any of the other Republicans he was running against that the Republican base was not the Republican base of 40 years ago. They actually were against trade. So I do think that elite opinion, in this case of candidates in the discourse, can help drive public opinion. Now, the reality is support for trade went back up as soon after the election when people stopped talking about it. So it is, but to go to Ed's point, I mean, I think there is a distinction here. There's a left-wing populism in the United States. It doesn't necessarily manifest itself as anti-international liberal order. In other words, when we did a survey in the primaries of 2016, a majority of Bernie Sanders supporters thought free trade agreements were good for the country, even though their candidate was against it, because they liked Bernie for other reasons. You know, they liked him because he was anti-Wall Street. They liked him because he was anti-elite, or at least the financial elite.
Yeah. Free tuition. They like that free tuition part, too.
Yeah, well, they liked it. Look, I mean, as I said at the time, I mean, you know, this is like what people used to do to pander to farmers, right? I mean, this is, whether we think that the student loan program is a major problem and it got to be fixed in the United States, when you're handing out money, this is what traditional politicians do.
Let me wrap you guys up right here so that I can leave enough time for your questions. All of you have sat here through this discussion so patiently. So with our remaining 15 minutes, please throw out your questions to the panel. And it would help if you want to introduce yourself and where you're from first.
So, Troy with the Korea Economic Association, DC.
And you have a mic. Or you can just yell. All right.
Right. So Troy with the Korea Economic Association, Washington, D.C. And Bruce kind of briefly mentioned this earlier when he was talking about trade and Democrats, or self-identifying Democrats being more in favor than self-identifying Republicans. And Jiyoon just sort of got into this more. But I think, and one of the things I'd be interested in, you know, Ed and Chris and the rest of you as well, maybe. But when I look at this, and I started out, I worked in the Senate, I worked for a Democrat, and I look at the parties and I look at where things are now. To me, it looks as though the parties, both parties, have lost touch with their voters. That we're going through a political transition in the United States to where the parties' positions on issues are shifting. The parties' leaderships haven't necessarily caught up with that. I mean, let's be honest, I don't see, you know, Nancy Pelosi or even some of the people under her shifting to becoming more pro-free trade. But if you look at the people who vote Democratic, if you look at the businesses who support the Democratic Party, these are issues that are important to them. If you look at businesses who are starting to support the Republican Party, you look at their voters, trade, something that's a problem. So it's not just that issue, there's other issues where you can see that they're out of sync, but I mean, that's the one we've talked about today. So I'd be curious your thoughts on where you see the parties are if they realize that basically their base are shifting underneath them and that they're not necessarily in sync anymore. And then just, I don't mean to be pessimistic, but even on the Young side, Chris, I think one of the problems we have is when you look at the way technology is evolving, everything is about defining who you are and giving you exactly what you want. Now, the problem with that is it funnels you into these communities Bruce is talking about in everything you receive. And the challenge for that is like, I personally tend to have eclectic tastes, and I don't want somebody telling me, all right, based on this, here are the shows I think you should watch, here's the news I think you should read. I want to see what's there and then choose it. But instead, we're being told, you know, this is what you should watch, this is what you should read. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Wow.
Two-part question. So the party's leadership is out of sync with their voters. Anybody want to take a crack at that first?
I think that's clear on trade, for example. But as I say, Donald Trump intuitively understood that something that maybe the party leadership and his party didn't get. So most of the other candidates, if not all the other candidates in that primary, were free traders, and Donald Trump wasn't. Everybody's like, how can a Republican do this? Well, in fact, because it was really clear, staunch Republicans had turned against trade because the demographics of the party has changed over time. And so it probably has little to do with trade per se, and everything to do with this kind of changing demographics of the party.
Yeah. But I mean, if you think about Texas Republicans and Nebraska Republicans, they are for free trade.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, like I said, it has a lot to do with presidential elections where swing states are critical. So Texas Republicans and Nebraska Republicans, Georgia Republicans, they don't count in the making of U.S. foreign trade policy. But at the same time, I mean, I would say we should not overestimate the populism's influences in policy making, because I think the devils are in the details. If we would say that Trump's tariffs war on trade is driven by populism, then the details are here, like it's about executive orders, not legislative politics. If you bring the politics of free trade versus anti-trade to the Congress, then you will see a very, very different outcome. So this is a sort of learning process as well for the Republicans as well. I mean, Trump's reliance on this 1962 Trade Expansion Act, the National Security Clause. I mean, when the members of Congress wrote that bill in 1962, they never thought about any upcoming president who would make the best use of this small line of this huge act in 1962. So, and back again, the same thing happens here. The US-Korea free trade agreements, if you look at the agreements inside, there is no provision about the role of Congress when the two countries are trying to withdraw from the pact. So now they are learning from Trump that whenever they write this trade pact again, they need to put into this withdrawal kind of role for the Congress as well.
Yeah. That really isn't what Troy was asking about. I mean, it's important. He's saying the leadership of the parties are out of touch with their own people. And you know, the reason why Donald Trump got the nomination was nobody else in that party knew how to talk to the voters in the way that he did, right?
Ted Cruz didn't seem authentic to you?
I mean, don't get me started, please. We're trying to keep this a clean discussion. You know, this is about jobs. Everything he talked about trade was in terms of those dirty foreigners have cost you your jobs. So yeah, you could say it's old-fashioned racist populism, all that kind of stuff. But the voters didn't hear that part. The voters heard the jobs part. My kid can't get a job at my factory because my factory's gone, and the reason is blah, blah, blah. You know, so that's why I stressed, here I am a liberal Democrat, and I'm talking about tax policy to give companies a break for R&D. My God, we've made some progress here, right? So, you know, what is it that the leadership is not talking to the voter about? You know, if you go in and make a speech about trade, nobody cares. You know, but they sure do care about the jobs. Yeah. And I think that's really the thrust of your question. You know, Trump had a way of talking to his people and to enough of the American people. The trend, you know, they heard that part. You know, it was dog whistles and they got it. Hillary never quite got it. She thought if she had a 57-point plan for every grievance anybody ever had, that would bring them all in somehow in a grand coalition of desirables. Well, it didn't turn out to work that way.
Let me just add one footnote to the response to that. This goes to a point you made, Jiyoon, and that is Democrats kind of being out of touch. And this, I have to defend my side here, Chris. When Nancy Pelosi stands up and talks about $1,000 going back to somebody and that's a crumb, that is not what a real Democrat would have said 10 or 15 years ago. That is not what a grassroots Democrat expects their leader to be saying. I mean, that is really that's a San Francisco elitist talking, and that's as far out of probably I'd argue more out of touch than Ted Cruz.
Well, it's a hell of a thing that every leader of the Democratic Party is older than me. You know, so we got to, you know, we need some new faces because they're going to go to the heart of what Troy's talking about. You know, Nancy doesn't have any more idea to talk to the voters than you know, my cat Lucy.
Okay, where's the mic? We have a question from this side. Stand by. Maybe you can just yell it. That's fine. We can hear each other.
David J. from the U.S. Embassy, and I hear the points that America has fundamentally been sort of a populist country. It's not something that's new. I hear the point that it's on the left and on the right as well. The phrase taxation without representation comes to mind because I think that the liberal international order is taxation without representation. You see sovereignty, you see treasure, you see blood. Where is your representation for that? And so. Maybe instead of populism being populism versus the liberal international order, it could be taking this pause to bring participation back to the liberal international order. And is there a possibility for that with the party changes that you guys observe that is needed, perhaps technology that exists, that maybe there needs to be more complex, very annoying tax trade relief provisions and trade agreements? Is that so? In other words, I'm wondering if there is a path forward, and could this be actually a productive process?
Well, I do think. I mean, you're hitting at what I think is one of the fundamental political challenges of globalization is that more and more decisions that affect people's individual lives are taken further and further away from them, and that's their perception at least, and I think it's real. And we can make a rational argument, well, that's actually the best place to make those decisions in a global economy. But people feel disempowered. As Jim Steinberg said this morning, people, they don't think their voice is being heard. They don't see an opportunity for voice. And I think one of the challenges in governance going forward is, we did a survey last year and we asked people in the United States, would you like to see more of major decisions taken to a popular vote through a referendum? And like 60%, I think, of the American public said yes. Now, stop and think about the consequences of that, but look at California if you don't understand the consequences of that. But the point being, it is people saying, no one listens to me. The elites don't listen to me. The politicians don't. Washington doesn't. And I want my voice. And we have to figure out, how do you give people a sense of more participation in and control over the issues that directly affect their lives without, totally gumming up the system and nothing ever gets done. And I don't have an answer for that, but it seems to me it's the kind of political science democracy question going forward.
60% is on that side, but what percent of the American people even vote?
Well, see, that's the other problem. Would they show up to vote if you gave them a referendum?
Well, I remember that in the same poll, I think it's more than 70% of American people actually prefer the representative democracy.
Oh, no, they overwhelmingly support the representative, right? But also, 17% of Americans prefer military rule, and 22% of Americans say they'd like to have a rule by a strong leader who doesn't have to listen to Congress or the courts. So, there is a dissatisfaction there with the current regime that we also have to acknowledge.
Another question from the very back.
Thank you. My name is Joe Kishisha, and I'm at the King Faisal Center in Riyadh. Now, we spoke about Trump a great deal today and his impact on populism, but none of the panelists have addressed the impact that Trumpism, or what preceded Trumpism, is having in terms of impact on the institutions of the country. The United States, I feel that everybody this morning was talking about me, 45-year-old immigrant, 45 years ago going to the United States. I've always been impressed by the fact that the United States stood for institutional liberties. And what is the erosion that is underway, not just with President Trump, but for the past at least 2 or 3 decades, on the institutions of the United States, and what kind of a message does that send to the international community? If we no longer believe in the separation of powers, for example, between the executive, legislative, and the judiciary, why should we expect anybody else around the world to espouse to those kinds of principles? So what are your thoughts on the impact of the illiberal international order in the country on our institutions?
Who wants to take a crack at that one first?
Well, it's obviously a critical question, and I think where I would disagree with you, though, is that it goes back a generation or two. I really think it's a much more recent phenomenon, and it's much more a factor of the personality of the president that we have now, who sees it as in his self-interest to undermine public faith in every institution that we have. It's a tactic for him.
Dr. Feulner wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, I figured he probably did.
No.
But to me, I think you're right, that there is a loss of institutional faith. But what really scares the hell out of me every morning, and really makes me frightened every morning, I wake up and I hear the latest tweet talking about the lying Maggie Haberman and those every single thing is personal insult, denigrating the validity of every institution we've got as a tactic. My God, we've never had that before. Never. Well, and we're having trouble adjusting to dealing with it.
But, Chris, I think the question, one of the reasons it may be effective for Trump is that I think you're right. The data is very clear. The decline in faith of institutions preceded Trump.
Yeah.
So, okay, he may have amplified this. He may have accelerated the decline. He certainly benefits from, kicking someone that's already down. but there is a broader issue of, do these institutions, which we revere, and maybe they weren't as strong as we always thought they were, but my personal view is that institutions are only as good as the people who populate them.
Yeah.
And so the strength of institutions is something that has to be renewed by the people who actually are in charge of them and run them and are engaged in them, and that's the real challenge.
Well, as a congressional staffer, a lifetime, and I'm sure Troy would agree, and all of us who've worked on the Hill hasn't done his job properly since really the late 80s. When I was on House Foreign Affairs Committee staff, if they didn't get their damn budget passed by March, you got fired, and the chairman got kicked off, and that's how it worked. When was the last time the committees passed their budgets? I don't remember.
I know.
So you're absolutely institutionally the one that I know the most about and feel the most about. I'm a child of it. Everything I have comes from it. They haven't done their damn job for a generation or two, and they seem to be oblivious.
Dr. Feulner, I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay, couple points. Number one, the man in the White House really does believe in this. There's a copy of the Constitution. I bet you don't have one in your pocket, do you, Chris?
I have it memorized.
Okay, you got it. He really does. The second thing is when we talk about disillusionment with institutions, again, the example I did of China taking all the loans from the IMF. The IMF was a huge bipartisan effort, and Bretton Woods and all the rest of it, and look how it's been perverted in the meantime. And yeah, we do lose faith in institutions that aren't reinvigorated or re-examined and brought up to date. Like Chris, I'm a congenital optimist. I think we can get over it. But as I said this morning, it needed in Washington somebody from outside the system to come in and say, hey, so many areas the emperor has no clothes, we got to do something about it. And by gosh, he's trying to do something about it. Might not be the most effective, and I probably wouldn't tweet quite as often as he does, but and he's a disruptor, but he's changing the debate, and I think it's for the good.
Well, when Donald Trump was elected as a president of the United States, a lot of people asked me, so what's going to happen? Because we never know. I mean, this is very unpredictable. And I told them that it's the United States of America, and this is the country that system works and institutions works, and I believe in that. So even though, sometimes the Trump is erratic, unpredictable, but system will fix it. That's what I told her. Well, to be frank, it's not as working as I expected, but I still have a belief that it has a long tradition of the system and institution. They created it, some geniuses created it. The one thing I'm cautious is, well, it may back up a little step back, but it will bounce back. But as I said in my speech in the beginning, will the world wait? That's the question I still have.
Yeah.
All right.
What damage is done in the meantime? That's what we worry about.
All right. Thank you so much to the panelists for a lively discussion, and thanks to all of you for being here. We appreciate it.
We will now take a 10-minute coffee break. Our second plenary session will begin in the Grand Ballroom 1 at 2:45. Thank you very much.